Hello everyone. Let's begin our session tonight with a quick story. Once upon a time, all the kings of Greece united in a war against the most powerful city in the world, Troy. For 10 long years, they besieged the city. The gods got involved and supported their champions. Countless warriors and many heroes fell on both sides. Finally, the Greeks vanquished the Trojans, in no small part thanks to a ploy imagined by the king of Ithaca, Odysseus. They built a large, hollow wooden horse in which Greek soldiers stayed hidden, and they pretended to withdraw from the war. Blinded by joy that the war was finally over, and their judgment troubled by the gods, who had decided that Troy shall fall, the Trojans dragged the horse inside their walls. At night, the hundreds of Greek ships came back to the shore, and the small group of warriors led by Odysseus that had remained hidden in the horse slayed the guards and opened the city doors from inside. That night, what force and bravery had not accomplished in 10 years, trickery did. Troy fell, defeated by ruse. Some even said, by a less than honorable stratagem. But glory is always on the side of the victors, and the Greeks celebrated their victory, looting and destroying the city that had resisted for so long. They had remained far from home for such a long time that all of them, warriors and kings alike, now only wished to go back to their land, their wives and their homes. Each king, each captain, led their men back home. Families were finally reunited after 10 long years of waiting. But not all of them. Following the end of the war, almost all Greek kings had returned, except Odysseus. In his small island kingdom of Ithaca, his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus, who was still an infant when he had gone to war, were still waiting for their husband and their father. Odysseus had been missing for several years, and only the thinnest thread of hope to see him again one day remained. Odysseus wasn't dead, and his protector, goddess Athena, had not abandoned him. But his way back home would be one of the most extraordinary adventures ever told. And this is the story I'm going to tell you tonight. So welcome everyone, and first make yourself comfortable because we have a lot to discover. We're going to follow the steps of Odysseus, his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus, as told in one of the most ancient known pieces of literature, the Odyssey by Homer. If you are interested in the events of the Trojan War, you can also listen to my other recent story about it, but this is not necessary to follow this one. And if you want more Greek mythology, there is yet another recent story I made about the 12 labors of Heracles You will find links in the description. As usual, I will tell you the episodes of the story, and in between, we'll take a look at where they come from, what they meant to the ancient Greeks, what makes the Odyssey a singular work, and how a story that was put in writing almost 3,000 years ago still feels very modern, not really because of its content, but rather because of its narrative structure. But we're going to take all this in an orderly fashion, and all you have to do is relax and listen. I'll do the rest. You may close your eyes at any time, as just listening is enough to follow along. And if you wish to navigate the story, as usual, there are timestamps in the first comment. They can help you resume where you left. If this is easier for you, you can also listen to my stories on other platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, or Amazon. There are links in the first comment too. And now even as a podcast on Patreon. By joining my Patreon, you can also support the channel and contribute to keep it free of video ads. You can download videos and audios and participate in surveys too. But let's return to our story. And before we find out where Odysseus was for all these years, we're going to make a first stop at Ithaca, which has changed a lot in his absence. Long before the Trojan War, Odysseus had reigned over his island of Ithaca with his wife, Penelope, a Spartan princess. He had fallen in love with her when in Sparta and brought her to Ithaca. Years later, Helen of Sparta was abducted by Paris of Troy in the events that led to the Trojan War, and her lawful husband, Menelaus, called upon the kings of Greece to defend his honor and retrieve her. Odysseus was one of them, but he had no taste for adventure or war, especially far away from home. So he tried to avoid being involved by pretending he was mad. When Menelaus' envoys arrived in Ithaca, he hooked a donkey and an ox to his plow, and he started sowing his fields with salt. The stratagem was quickly discovered when one of the envoys placed his infant, the young Telemachus, in front of the plow. Odysseus had to stop, exposing that he was only pretending to be mad. He had to follow them and participate in the war. Contrary to so many heroes who were examples of bravery and went by a very strict honor code, Odysseus was more cautious. He wasn't a coward and knew how to take risks. For example, when years later he stayed inside the Trojan horse. But he was also a family man, not an adventurer, and was deeply attached to his land. It would have deeply saddened him to know what had happened in Ithaca in his absence. Seeing that he still hadn't returned from the war several months after it had ended, dozens of suitors from Ithaca had invaded his palace, where Penelope and Telemachus still lived. They wanted Penelope to acknowledge that her husband was dead, and each of them aimed to persuade her for her hand in marriage. The suitors had not waited for the confirmation of Odysseus' death to start stealing from him. They lived in his house, ate his cattle and harvests, and disrespected his wife by pressuring her, becoming bolder and more insolent each day. Telemachus had grown up to become a young man. He enraged each day at the impudence of the suitors, but didn't know what to do to restore order in Ithaca. But this was about to change. Odysseus had always had a protectress, goddess Athena. Thanks to her powers, she knew that Odysseus was still alive and why he had not returned. He had angered Poseidon, god of the seas. During the Trojan War, Athena was firmly on the side of the Greeks, whereas other gods like Poseidon, Aphrodite, and Apollo supported the Trojans. They had had to accept the fall of Troy, but Poseidon had kept a grudge against Odysseus, as the Greek king was directly responsible for the fall of Troy, and he had done it using a horse, animals that belonged to Poseidon. One day, the god of the seas left Mount Olympus, the residence of the gods, to accept a sacrifice far in the south in Ethiopia. Athena took advantage of his absence to ask Zeus, king of the gods, to finally allow Odysseus to return. Zeus consented to it, and Athena immediately drew up plans to help the lost hero. At the time of these events, Odysseus was held captive on an island. He had been a captive for several years already, kept against his will by Calypso, a nymph. But since his departure from Troy, before his arrival to Calypso's island, extraordinary adventures had happened to him. He had left Troy with 12 ships, hoping he would be back to Ithaca a few weeks later. But his companions wanted to return with more treasures than they already found in Troy, and they insisted to launch a raid on Ismaros, a defenseless coastal city in Thrace, not far from the fresh ruins of Troy. Odysseus didn't like the idea, as he was eager to return home as soon as possible. But after 10 years of war, the looting of Troy was not enough of a prize to many of his warriors, and he finally agreed to the raid. The Greeks sacked the town, they divided the treasures among themselves, and then began to feast, despite Odysseus' advice that they leave immediately. While at Ismaros, Odysseus spared the life of a priest of Apollo and of his family. To thank him, the priest gave him a bottle of black wine, some gold, and a mixing bowl. The wine was a strong and divine drink. It was so concentrated that for each cup of wine, 20 times as much water was added to it to dilute it. Odysseus didn't know what to do with this bottle of wine, but it could always be useful, so he kept it preciously. Tired by the fight and their feast, the Greeks fell asleep in the ruins of Ismaros. But the next morning, the inhabitants returned with reinforcements, and the looters were surprised by an angry crowd that outnumbered them. They had to escape, and Odysseus lost many men in the process before he could embark with the survivors and continue his journey to Ithaca. But Poseidon was watching, and he was decided to punish Odysseus, that he held responsible for the fall of Troy. He sent storms that drove the small fleet off course and scattered the ships. After days of fighting the elements, Odysseus' ship reached an island that could offer temporary shelter and let them repair before resuming their journey home. On this island, they saw a lush vegetation, beautiful flowers, and appetizing fruits that grew naturally and made it resemble a natural garden. They soon realized that there were inhabitants who smiled at them and welcomed them, but they didn't seem particularly interested in asking them where they came from. They saw that the inhabitants spent their days sleeping and eating the flowers and fruits of the magnificent tree at the center of the island. When asked what this tree was, they said it was the lotus tree, and that the tree provided anything they could ever wish for. A life of pleasant drowsiness, of oblivion and bliss. They offered flowers and fruits to Odysseus' companions, who soon joined the Lotus-Eaters in their state of stupor. 4 generations, lost ships had reached this island, the island of the lotus tree. The travelers had joined these people, forgetting about their previous life and indulging into a state of permanent daze where nobody and nothing else mattered, where time was abolished and the past or the future were no longer important. Odysseus understood the appeal and the danger of the lotus tree. The memory of his island, of Penelope, and of his son, Telemachus, were precious enough to his heart to renounce the bliss of the lotus tree. All his companions were now in an unconscious state, and Odysseus carried them, one by one, back to the ships. When they woke up and asked for more flowers and more fruits from the lotus tree, he forced them to fast. The warriors wept, but soon enough they recovered their memories and remembered who they were. Odysseus asked them whether they would rather stay on the island with the Lotus-Eaters and forget everything, or return home. As the effects of the drug were now vanishing, they decided to leave, and the expedition resumed its journey. I told you in previous stories about the various functions of mythology, of mythological tales in ancient Greek society. One stands out in this episode. It is obviously a cautionary tale against addiction, and beyond that, an invitation to reflect on what it is to be a person. If you decide to renounce your memory and abdicate all responsibility in the world, what does remain of your humanity? And yet the perspective to stop suffering and caring is always appealing. The story of the Lotus-Eaters highlights that one dimension of addiction, or the wish for oblivion, is a death wish. Disappearing as a conscious being is a form of death, not a biological one, but the erasure of what makes a singular individual be who he or she is a way of disappearing. And the high road of rejecting this wish is not easy or immediately gratifying. It's hard. It will be worth for Odysseus in the end, because this story has a happy end, but not before trials and suffering. These concepts of self-control, moderation, and responsibility were highly praised and valued in classical Greece. They were some of the qualities that were expected from citizens. To an extent they are universal because they are necessary to make any society work. But Greek literature is one of the first examples in the world of intellectual work that integrates them in stories, that builds storytelling around moral precepts. This is one of the innovations that came with it. Another innovation specific to the Odyssey is the narrative structure. It's a poem like the Iliad. The Iliad recounts a short period by the end of the Trojan War, and they both are very long poems. The Odyssey has more than 12,000 lines. It was probably intended to be heard rather than read, but it looks a lot like a modern novel when you take a look at the structure. The plot is non-linear. There are flashbacks, elements that complement the story of the Trojan War. For example, the Trojan horse. It was not in the Iliad, and we learn about it in the Odyssey, when Odysseus tells of it. But the Odyssey also has a way of keeping people on edge. It doesn't begin as a linear storyline when Odysseus leaves Troy. It begins in Ithaca, 10 years after the end of the Trojan War, and we discover the situation of the island with Penelope, Telemachus, the invasion of the palace by the Suitors. Athena intervenes to help Odysseus return home. We learn later that he is kept prisoner by the nymph Calypso on her island. Calypso has to free him because Zeus sends the messenger of the gods, Hermes, to order her to do so, after Athena has pleaded his cause. Odysseus escapes, I will tell you about that later, and reaches another island, where he is offered hospitality and tells the story of his peregrinations since he left Troy. So we learn about earlier episodes through his account, and the bulk of the Odyssey, which is a series of adventures he lived on his attempt to return home, unfolds as he tells the story years after it happened. It is a story within the story, and Odysseus is the narrator. For our story tonight, I am taking all the elements from the Odyssey, but not telling them in the exact order they appear in the poem. Otherwise you would have waited maybe half an hour before hearing about the actual adventures of Odysseus. Instead, I am following the two main plot lines in parallel. The one that happens in the present of the narration, 10 years after Odysseus' disappearance, and the one that happens in the past, the series of adventures he went through, until the two plotlines are joined when he returns to Ithaca to claim his throne. So we left Odysseus escaping the island of the Lotus-Eaters. Now let's go to Ithaca. Athena obtained the liberation of her favorite hero from the island of Calypso, but she also wanted him to recover his throne. So, after visiting Zeus, she went to Ithaca, disguised as a chieftain from the islands of Tapos. The Tapians were renowned sea travelers, and sometimes pirates, who knew a lot about what happened at sea. She visited Telemachus to urge him to leave the island and search for news of his father. Ignoring that he was talking to a mighty goddess, Telemachus offered her hospitality, and that night she saw how the suitors imposed their presence and disrespected the lawful queen and prince of Ithaca in the absence of Odysseus. That night, Athena changed appearance again to look like Telemachus, and she found a ship and a crew for the true prince. The next day, she convinced Telemachus to depart to the mainland to start searching for his father. And once again, she changed appearance. She was now disguised as Mentor, a wise and old man who had been charged by Odysseus to educate his son. Unaware that he was accompanied by Athena herself and not the real Mentor, Telemachus set sail to the Greek mainland with the intention to visit the most venerable surviving Greek warrior from the Trojan War, Nestor. Nestor was already old when the Trojan War had begun, but he had bravely led the armies of his kingdom, Pylos, and had helped Greek warriors with his advice. But Nestor didn't know where Odysseus was, and unfortunately couldn't help. After his visit to Nestor, Telemachus traveled to Sparta to talk to King Menelaus and his wife, Helen, who were now reconciled. Helen was not herself when she had followed Paris to Troy. She had been the victim of a fit of lust brought on by Aphrodite. Menelaus and Helen told Telemachus that their voyage back from Troy had also been long and difficult. They had gone to Egypt on the way back to Sparta, and there, on the island of Pharos, Menelaus had encountered an old god of the sea, Proteus. And Proteus had told Menelaus that Odysseus had gone through many hardships on his way back, and was now a captive of the nymph Calypso on her island. Telemachus was sorry to know about how hard it had been for his father, but was overwhelmed with joy when he realized that he was still alive, and that hope of seeing him again was justified. As he listened to this reassuring news, however, the suitors in Ithaca realized that he had escaped the island. Angry that they had let the son of Odysseus escape, they formulated a plan to ambush his ship when he would return. Telemachus and Penelope's trials were real, but Odysseus and his men had gone through a true ordeal since their departure from Troy 10 years earlier. They had narrowly escaped the vengeful inhabitants of Ismaros and the trap of the lotus tree. But it seemed that after those dangers, their luck was returning. They approached a new island that looked welcoming and would offer a perfect place to rest and find food. What they ignored is that this island belonged to the Cyclops. The Cyclops were giants with a single eye. They lived in the world of men, but not among them. The location of their land was unknown, and many even doubted their existence. But they were real, and they lived like men did before they became civilized. They were shepherds, with herds of giant sheep, but had no agriculture, no wine, and stayed in caves. Their father was Poseidon, the god of the seas who already followed Odysseus with his anger. The Cyclops were savages. They slaughtered and ate all who came to their land. They lived solitary lives and had no interest in knowing anything about the world. Odysseus and his companions ignored all this, and they didn't know they had landed close to the lair of one of these Cyclops, a terrifying giant named Polyphemus. In their search for provisions, Odysseus, with a group of men, found the entrance to his cave, and in the cave, more cheese and meat that they could ever have dreamed of. But as they were celebrating their find, the Cyclops Polyphemus returned with his flock. He entered the cave and sealed its entrance with a great stone. Ignorant of the rules of hospitality and seeing a good occasion to eat something new, he caught 2 of the men and ate them. He then fell asleep, and Odysseus and his surviving men spent the night hiding and trembling, unable to escape the cave as the entrance was blocked by a rock that no man could move. In the morning, the giant killed and ate 2 more men, and left the cave to graze his sheep. Still unable to leave the cave, Odysseus spent the day thinking of a possible escape. But it seemed the situation was hopeless, and the Cyclops would kill and eat them all before long. After Polyphemus returned in the evening and ate 2 more of the men, Odysseus had an idea. He offered the Cyclops some strong and undiluted wine from the bottle he had received as a gift earlier by the priest of Apollo in Ismaros. Cyclops didn't know wine, and Polyphemus was soon drunk and unwary. He asked Odysseus his name and promised him a gift if he answered. Odysseus told him his name was Nobody, and as a reward, Polyphemus only promised to eat this nobody last of all. And with that, he fell into a drunken sleep. But Odysseus was not one to wait for death. Meanwhile, he had hardened a wooden stake in the fire, and when the giant fell asleep, he drove it into his one eye. Distraught and blinded, the Cyclops called for help, and his brothers, who lived in other caves on the island, arrived. When they asked what had happened, he told them that nobody had hurt him, and they thought Polyphemus was being afflicted by a fit of madness. They could only recommend him to pray and rest. In the morning, the blind Cyclops let the sheep out to graze, but he certainly didn't want to let the men escape. So he felt the sheep's back with his hands. However, Odysseus and his men had tied themselves to the underside of the animals, and so could get away without the giant noticing. They ran to the ship and sailed off. But as they were moving off, Odysseus, who was too proud of his intelligence, committed an act of hubris. He revealed his real name. The giant heard him, and not only did he cast huge rocks towards the ship that Odysseus barely escaped, he also prayed to his father, Poseidon, for revenge. Poseidon was already angry at Odysseus. He would now be furious. Before we continue with the adventures of Odysseus, let's take a look at the character himself. To the Greeks, Odysseus was maybe the most popular of all heroes, and he is different from most of them. All Greek heroes are models, but they are not all the same. They have different personalities, and they also have flaws alongside some outstanding capabilities. They may be extraordinary warriors who also have a whimsical or bad character, like Achilles as presented in the Iliad. They can be reckless or commit horrible crimes, like Heracles before he begins his labors, that are initially a punishment he accepts to erase his sin of killing his wife and children in a fit of rage. In the case of Odysseus, the quality that stands out is his intelligence. In various definitions of the term, he understands fast, he anticipates, he tricks others. But this intelligence also has its limits. He doesn't always anticipate the consequences of his actions, like when he angers gods or when he reveals his real name to the Cyclops. He brags, and like anyone who claims to be smart, the claim itself reveals the limit of their intelligence. There is a lack of understanding of how it is going to be taken, perceived by others, and a lack of self-awareness. This pride that can lead to hubris, that is to say, an excess of self-confidence that for the Greeks could lead to excessive pride or defiance towards the gods and bring disaster. This is a serious flaw. He has other characteristics that make him human too. He's not particularly brave. He pretends to be mad to avoid war before the Trojan War. But he is also loyal. He loves his wife, his son, his land. And in Greek myth, be it in the Iliad or the Odyssey or other stories in the same cycle, he is on the right side. The side of the Greeks and the side we are invited to root for. The way he is presented makes him likable in the Greek tradition. But later, when the Romans adopted many Greek myths and added their own, they turned him into a villain, insisting on the less honorable aspects of the character. To the Romans, he was Ulysses. They Romanized a lot of names. The Romans knew the Odyssey. They studied it and appreciated it, but in their own tradition, many of his actions, the tricks and stratagems he employed, his attempt to avoid his sacred oath to defend Menelaus and Helen and not join the Trojan War, all of this offended their notion of honor and duty. It would have to be nuanced depending on the periods and depending on the authors. But in general, the Romans were more rigid and strict about these values in comparison with the Greeks, who had a less Manichaean view of them and could appreciate a good trickster. The Roman rejection of Odysseus, of Ulysses, culminated in the Aeneid, which is a Latin epic poem written in the 1st century BC, on the model of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I could tell you about it in another story because it is less universally famous than the Odyssey, but the story itself is really good and creative. The Aeneid is a mythical retelling of the origins of Rome. It follows the travel of Aeneas, one of the Trojan heroes from the Iliad. But instead of dying when Troy falls, he escapes on a long journey to Italy, where he becomes the ancestor of the Romans. The Aeneid makes the Romans the descendants of the Trojans, which at the same time acknowledges their connection to Greek civilization, but also puts them on the other side of a divide. It draws a line between the two. As the main architect of the fall of Troy, with the trick that the Trojan horse is, Odysseus appears as a villain in the Aeneid, and he is constantly referred to as cruel Odysseus or deceitful Odysseus. So in the last centuries of ancient Rome, the Aeneid was written by Virgil, a poet, at the time of the fall of the Republic, when Rome became an empire and was expanding faster than ever. At the time, educated people were probably well aware that the Aeneid was not history and just a work of fiction made to cement a Roman mythology. But Odysseus had the image of a villain and an antagonist. It took centuries to restore his reputation as a character and return to the generally positive description we are used to nowadays. Now let's resume our story. Odysseus had foolishly taunted and revealed his real name to the Cyclops. He could avoid the rocks the giant threw, but not the curse of Poseidon. The Cyclops prayed to his father and asked him to curse Odysseus, to curse him to wander the sea for 10 years, during which he would lose all his crew. Following their escape from the land of the Lotus-Eaters, Odysseus and his men had reached the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, near the island of Sicily. This was where he had narrowly escaped death from the Cyclops. But they hadn't found the supplies they desperately needed. And as soon as they saw another island where they could anchor, they decided to make a stop. This island was on no map because it was a floating island, and it belonged to King Aeolus, a powerful but benevolent man who had received from the gods the responsibility to keep the winds. Even though he wasn't a god, the keeper of the winds had considerable power and wealth, and his control over the winds could almost make him rival Poseidon himself, extending his power to what happened above the surface of the seas. Aeolus greeted Odysseus and gave him and his crew hospitality for a month. He appreciated Odysseus and decided to help him return home. He told our hero that he would provide his ship with the exact wind it needed to take them back to Ithaca, and he gave him a large leather bag that contained all the winds, a gift that should ensure a quick and safe return home. Rested and optimistic, the Greeks returned to their ships after thanking Aeolus and sailed to their island. As promised by the keeper of the winds, the journey was fast and eventless, and after a few days, Ithaca came into sight. Relieved but exhausted, Odysseus fell asleep, dreaming of his coming reunion with Penelope and his home. But his men were intrigued by the leather bag and thought it contained a treasure given by Aeolus. If it was gold, it was only fair that they receive their share. As Odysseus was sleeping, they opened the bag to see what it contained. All of the winds immediately flew out, and a violent storm drove the ship away from Ithaca. After hours of storm, when the ship could not be controlled, they realized they had returned to the floating island of Aeolus. Aeolus recognized that Odysseus had drawn the ire of the gods upon himself, and afraid to displease them, he refused to help again. Odysseus had to leave the island empty-handed, and still followed by the wrath of Poseidon. The men re-embarked, and on their following stop, they were once again faced with cannibalistic giants, not the Cyclops this time, but a tribe of man-eating giants who had sprung from a son of Poseidon, Laestrygonian. For this reason they were known as the Laestrygonians. As soon as Odysseus arrived close enough to the coast of their island, they attacked with rocks, and the king of Ithaca once again narrowly escaped death, losing many of his companions. He sailed on a severely damaged ship, and the ship almost grounded on the beach of another island, an island where a new danger awaited them. The island belonged to Circe, an enchantress. Circe was a daughter of the god of the sun, Helios, and she was renowned for her vast knowledge of potions, herbs, and terrifying magic powers. She lived in a palace, far from any human presence, in the midst of a dense wood. Her palace was surrounded by lions and wolves, and many other animals, but all of them were surprisingly docile and peaceful. Circe's island hid a terrible secret. She attracted the travelers who landed on her island with her beautiful singing and invited them to a feast. But then she drugged them with potions that make the unfortunate visitors change shape and turn into animals. The lions and wolves living around the palace were in reality former men who had had the misfortune to cross her path. But nobody knew her secret, as no one had ever escaped the trap that her island was. When Odysseus and his crew landed on the island, most of the men went to explore it, and their leader stayed on the ship. The crew met Circe, who invited them to a feast that the hungry sailors couldn't resist. Of course, she had mixed one of her magical potions to the dishes, and the potion turned all of them into swine. The only man to escape the curse was Odysseus' second in command, Eurylochus, who had remained cautious and not touched the food. Eurylochus returned to the ship and warned Odysseus, who immediately went on a rescue mission and walked to the palace. But before he reached it, the messenger of gods, Hermes, appeared, sent by Athena. Hermes revealed how Circe could be defeated. He gave him an herb that would protect him from the effects of her potions, and recommended that he drew his sword and forced her to swear that she would not take any further action against him. Odysseus followed these instructions and was able to force the enchantress to free his men. They were changed into human beings again. The crew was exhausted and needed to rest. So did Odysseus, and he couldn't help but notice that Circe was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen, almost rivaling the legendary beauty of Helen of Sparta. The stay on the island lasted days, then weeks, as Odysseus began to share Circe's bed, and months, and finally an entire year. Odysseus was still homesick, and the charms of Circe had not erased the memory of Penelope, and one day he resolved to leave the enchantress and resume his journey. Circe was not surprised, as she knew the heart of man and could also see glimpses of the future. So she didn't oppose Odysseus' decision, and instead instructed him that in order to return to Ithaca, he would have to visit the Underworld first. The entrance to the Underworld was in the west, where the sun goes to die every evening before it reappears in the east every morning. Guided by Circe's instructions, Odysseus and his crew crossed the Mediterranean Sea far, far to the west, near the Pillars of Heracles that marked the end of the world and the beginning of an endless ocean. They reached a harbor at the western edge of the world, where Odysseus sacrificed to the dead. A darkness fell around him, and suddenly Odysseus found himself in an unknown wasteland, where the ghosts of the deceased wandered aimlessly. He first encountered the spirit of one of his crewmen, Elpenor, who had died on Circe's island. He had fallen off a roof, and his body had not been found. He asked Odysseus to find and bury his remains. Odysseus promised. He then summoned the spirit of Tiresias, a prophet of Apollo who had died long before and was famous for his clairvoyance. He asked the spirit how to appease Poseidon, and the prophet told him that one day himself and his crew would reach an island where Helios, the sun god, keeps his sacred livestock. If they refrained from eating the animals, then he may return home. But a failure to do so would result in the loss of his ship and his entire crew. Next, Odysseus met the spirit of his dead mother. She had died of grief during his long absence, and from her he got his first news of his own household, threatened by the greed and insolence of the Suitors. Odysseus stayed longer and talked to the spirit of his fallen companions, including Agamemnon and Achilles, until the fog around him began to dissipate. A ray of sunshine pierced the darkness, then two, then three, and he realized he had left the underworld and returned to the world of the living. The entire crew returned to Circe's island. As promised, they searched for the remains of Elpenor, the fallen crewman, buried him, and said goodbye to Circe, who offered them enough food to continue their journey. Leaving Circe's island to the east would force them to skirt the land of the Sirens, some of the most dangerous monsters in the entire world. The Sirens were not terrifying creatures with teeth and claws. Their dangerosity resided in their singing. They attracted nearby sailors with their enchanting music and singing voices. They were half women, half birds, and their voices were so irresistible that no man could resist it. Any ship would try to approach the rocky coasts of their island and be shipwrecked, even though sailors knew that answering the song of the Sirens was deadly. Odysseus had an idea of how to survive and avoid his ship to steer towards the rocks. He ordered his crewmen to have their ears plugged with beeswax, but he was also too curious and could not resist the temptation to hear this enchanting song of the Sirens. So he asked his men to tie him to the mast and not untie him under any pretext. As the ship approached the Sirens' island, he heard their voices, and his will was instantly annihilated. The only thing he could think of was to jump to the sea and swim to the coast. By chance, his men respected his orders and couldn't hear his supplications to untie him, so the ship successfully passed the island without losses. But this region of the sea was full of dangers. The ship now had to pass a narrow channel of water, where two dreadful threats awaited adventurous sailors. On one side lived Scylla, a six-headed monster ready to catch any ship passing by and cut it to pieces. On the other side, within an arrow's range, was Charybdis, a powerful whirlpool that would sink any vessel approaching too close. In order to avoid one of these dangers, sailors had to pass too close to the other one, and most ships attempting to cross the channel ended destroyed on one side or the other. Only a difficult, extremely narrow path was possible in between. But Odysseus and his crew had no choice but to take a chance. As they entered the channel, the waters became agitated, and Charybdis constantly tried to attract them, as Scylla's heads ventured dangerously close to the ship. At one point, Scylla was able to snatch up 6 men, who died between its jaws. But the ships successfully crossed, and they soon arrived to quieter waters. Soon, the island of Helios appeared on the horizon, the island where the sun god kept his livestock that Odysseus had been instructed to not eat at any cost. Odysseus wished to remain away from the island to avoid any risk, but the crew was becoming more and more unruly after all these ordeals, and they decided to override his orders. The ship landed the island. They had a lot of food given by Circe and promised Odysseus that they would not even look at Helios' livestock, and that they would resume their journey very soon. But the gods were watching the desperate attempts of this crew to return home, and had grown angry at Odysseus. Not only had he displeased Poseidon at Troy, and then offended him by blinding his cyclops son, he had defied them by receiving help from Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, and had a bit too much luck escaping so many dangers. Because gods are cruel and like to play with men, Zeus caused a storm which prevented the crew from leaving the island, and the storm seemed to never end. Days passed. Odysseus spent his time praying to the gods, hoping he could appease them this way. The crew needed to eat, and they depleted the food given to them by Circe. The men became hungry. After days spent fasting, they ignored the orders of Odysseus, who was away praying, and they hunted the sacred cattle of Helios. The sun god was infuriated, and he asked Zeus to punish them. Zeus suspended the storm, letting the men think that they could now leave. But as soon as they did, the storm resumed. The ship was uncontrollable, and the storm drove it towards Charybdis, the monstrous whirlpool. They suffered a shipwreck, and as the ship was crumbling, Odysseus was the only one able to catch the branches of a fig tree that extended above Charybdis. He clung to the tree, seeing all his companions drowning and their bodies drawn to the abyss with the remains of their ship. Odysseus was now alone. All his men were dead, and the ship was lost. The prophecy about the cattle of Helios was accomplished, and our hero was now more alone and more desperate. than ever. Barely willing to live, he let himself float on the sea, waiting for death to take him, as all hope had now vanished. Odysseus was too exhausted to cry, and too broken to find a reason to live. But it was written that death did not want him yet. Odysseus was washed ashore on another island where the nymph Calypso lived. The nymph took care of him and healed his body, but not his heart, as only Ithaca, Penelope, and Telemachus mattered to him. Days passed, and his strength returned. Calypso made him her lover, but he didn't feel anything for her. Weeks passed, then months, without a ship and not knowing where he was. Odysseus had no possibility to escape. Months turned to years, and after the excitement of danger and action, his life turned to boredom, homesickness, and desperation. 7 years passed. Odysseus had lost count of days, months, and years, and didn't even realize that it had been almost 10 years since his departure from Troy. Nor did he remember that Poseidon's curse, after he blinded the Cyclops, was nearing its end, and that he still had an ally on Mount Olympus, Athena. As we saw at the beginning, at the time Telemachus had now turned into an adult, he had received a visit from Athena in disguise, who guided him to the mainland to investigate about his father. And Athena also obtained from Zeus that the messenger of gods, Hermes, be sent to Calypso's island to instruct her to release her prisoner. Calypso had no choice but to accept. She gave him a small boat and let him go. Odysseus sailed a few days alone and reached an island where friendly foreigners gave him hospitality. They recognized him as the king of Ithaca, whose fame after the Trojan War and mysterious disappearance 10 years earlier was now established. Odysseus told them what had happened, and from his mouth they learned all the episodes of his incredible journey, his Odyssey, that we just traveled with him. They resolved to help him, and at night, when he was asleep, they defied Poseidon's curse to swiftly transport him to the shore of Ithaca. When Odysseus woke up, he opened his eyes alone on the beach, and disoriented, he didn't know where he was. Athena appeared to him and revealed that he was back to his land, back to Ithaca. But he would have to fight to take it back from the suitors and traitors who had disrespected his house. She disguised him as an elderly beggar, so he would be able to see by himself how things stood in his household. Meanwhile, Telemachus was returning from his visit to Sparta, and father and son were secretly reunited in the hut of one of Odysseus' old slaves, who had remained loyal to his master. Still disguised as a beggar, Odysseus went to his palace and saw how the suitors lived there, and humiliated his wife, that he saw again for the first time in 20 years. Athena was still working behind the scenes. The next day, she inspired Penelope to announce the suitors that they would finally be able to compete for her hand. There would be an archery competition using Odysseus' bow. This bow was famously hard to string. It required an uncommon strength that few men possessed. Penelope announced that the man who would be able to string the bow and shoot an arrow through a dozen aligned axe heads would win. The competition began in the palace's hall, with the suitors eager to show their talent, and Odysseus, still in disguise, watching the scene. One after the other, the suitors failed to shoot the arrow through the axe heads, until Odysseus moved and required to try. Under the suitors' laughs, he took the bow and shot, sending the arrow right through the 12 axe heads. Immediately he took another arrow and started shooting at the suitors, killing them methodically. Inspired by Athena, Telemachus and other servants joined him, and a ferocious fight ensued until no suitor was left. Finally, he took out his beggar's clothes and identified himself to Penelope. Penelope was hesitant at first, but she recognized him when he mentioned that he made their bed from an olive tree that was still rooted to the ground. Odysseus was finally reunited with his family, his land, and granted the happiness he had been longing for 20 long years since his departure. All is well that ends well. This is the end of tonight's story. You may now let yourself drift to a restful sleep, and I'll be back soon with a new one. This time we will travel to China and explore the wonders of the Forbidden City. In the meantime, sweet dreams. Au revoir.